Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I am truly honored to be able to host this panel and also have it as one of the latest interactions and discussions that we're going to have today. And first of all, I would like to thank Leiden University and the CPDP to allow me to host this panel with such distinguished guests. And I want to briefly mention the idea where it came from, and then introduce the panelists who don't really need that much introduction, but anyway. So I'm Lex Zard from Leiden University. I'm working on the thesis called Consumer Manipulation via Online Behavioral Advertising, trying to map the boundaries of the legal boundaries of manipulation in the European Union. And of course, obviously, it's really difficult to find very precise boundaries, but even the very not so precise contours of what I have found, it's making clear that online behavioral advertising, as it is now and as it has been for many years now, is somewhat inconsistent with the European Union values, and not just values, but also clear legal rules. And I wanted to ask this question to the leading experts, whoever I could reach, if it is actually coming to an end, or if it's just a shift that I merely see through my naive junior researcher glasses. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity. You see on the left Marco Blocher, who is working for NOYB, and I think NOYB doesn't need that much introduction, but I would like to call it like private prosecutor of the European Union, who tries to enforce the European rules in particular, and also in the context of online behavioral advertising. We have Paul Nemitz, who is principal advisor of DigiJust of the European Commission, but who also has an academic spirit, and his new book is coming out, is about to come out, about discussing democratic values and the human-centered values in the age of artificial intelligence. Wojciech Wiewiórowski, who is, of course, it was announced earlier today as the Tsar of the data protection, but I also know him as a voracious reader and a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And Sandra Wachter, who is joining us online, a professor at the Oxford Internet Institute, but also a researcher and academic who is inspiring, and I think the peers and the colleagues really admire and respect her, and I think it's really, thank you, Sandra, for joining us to share your opinions with us today. And last but not least, Mireille Hildebrandt, who started all these discussions way before it became discussed in the policy discussions. So I will be asking them the question whether the status quo in the online behavioral advertising or in the central business model of online platforms is actually has changed, is changing, or will change at some point in the near future. Before I do that and I start the discussion, I want to briefly mention that today is also the Independence Day in Georgia, and I know that it's a bit alien for many of Europeans when we speak about Georgia, but it is also, and some Georgians like myself do believe that we contribute to the European family, and and there are places such as Kiev and Tbilisi where still the fight for the democracy and the European values is going on. That being said, I will start by first addressing the question to Marco, and briefly to introduce the agenda of how are we going to do that. I will give the opening statement to each panelist, which will be around 8 minutes. Then we are going to have a discussion and respond to each other's speech, but also definitely we will have 15 minutes to also ask questions from the audience. Marco, can you tell us not just the recent EDPB decision, but also the consent bypass case, and generally about NOYB's actions against the online behavioral advertising, and your opinion of how it's taking shape? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, and I'm really looking forward to my co-panelists' statements on this interesting matter. Yeah, so we now have the EDPB's decision, following that the DPC's decision that on online behavioral advertisement, and I first want to put the cases by NOYB that led to this decision a bit into perspective. NOYB's complaints that now led to these decisions were not exclusively about online behavioral advertisement, but much broader. They challenged the situation that Meta in 2018, when the GDPR became applicable, took their consent forms and just put them into the terms and conditions. And we argued that this evasive maneuver was not meeting the GDPR's requirement and consent, and therefore the processing based on it would be unlawful. And again, this did not only concern online behavioral advertisement, but also other processing activities, such as data processing for improving Meta services, cross-platform data sharing, but also the processing of Article 9 data, so biometric data, but also inferred information such as sexual orientation or political affiliation. So what happened next after the complaints were filed? To our surprise, Meta then argued that they were not relying on consent at all, but that any processing activity mentioned in the terms and conditions was all of a sudden necessary to perform the contract with the platform users. And interestingly, we later also learned that this conduct had apparently been agreed on in meetings between the DPC and Meta prior to the applicability of the GDPR. So it was not that surprising that the DPC was not overly eager to take a closer look into Meta's conduct here. And that was sort of when the procedures went south, because the DPC then took the position that they will only investigate the lawfulness of consent, so the lawfulness of the processing based on consent, but they refused to really look into the question whether or not Meta can base these processing activities on Article 6.1b. The DPC even argued that it would be ultra-virus, so exceeding their competence to look into a contract because only a court could do that. And yeah, as you might know, the DPC also tried to write social media or processing for social media into the EDPB guidelines and Article 6.1b. That failed. Next, the DPC tried to have the EDPB suspend the publication of these guidelines until the Meta cases are decided, which fortunately also didn't happen. But we can see that there was a certain reluctance of the DPC to really investigate these issues. Yeah, I'm not bothering you with further details of these cases, which are unfortunately to some extent are still ongoing. They're still pending and far from over. But my main points are first that it was the other DPAs that even made the DPC investigate the issue of lawfulness under Article 6.1b or the lack of lawfulness, and then overruled the DPC's view that Meta can more or less do as they please under Article 6.1b if they just put the processing activities into the contract. And second, the EDPB decisions now focus on online behavioral on behavioral advertisement, but do not handle the other processing activities mentioned in NOYB's complaints. And just regarding the processing of Article 9 data, the decisions at least contain an order for the DPC to now commence proper investigation into that matter. And as we all know, the DPC wasn't overly happy with that and challenged this order before the General Court. So we can see that there is, again, little interest to put Meta's business model under close scrutiny. And yeah, one last remark, and then I'll switch to the status quo of online behavioral advertisement. The surprisingly narrow focus of the EDPB decisions might, to a certain extent, also be due to the fact that the DPC only shared selected case files with their colleagues. So everything that did not really fit the narrative of their draft decision might have not been put to the attention of their colleagues. And we know that, for example, for some of NOYB's submissions, that they were just simply ignored, which leads us now to the situation that not all of the claims have been settled. Now, talking about the status quo of online behavioral advertisement, so Meta's switch to use contract as a legal basis failed. And I'm pretty sure that the CJEU will confirm this legal position in the cases pending on that matter. And I'm also pretty certain that its switch to legitimate interest will fail as well. Legitimate interest can be a solid legal basis for a certain kind of advertisement, but certainly not for online behavioral advertisement with this massive amounts of data from numerous sources being collected, profiled and merged. To me, it's pretty clear that the data subjects' rights and freedoms overrule the surveillance capitalistic interests of Meta and its partners. And when it comes to Article 9 data, there's not even a need for discussion. Those can't be processed based on legitimate interest. So all Meta is doing here is buying time to make a profit, again, at the expense of people's rights. And they very well know that the DPC won't bother to go after their conduct if the DPC is not being pushed by civil society or by the other DPAs. Yeah, so legitimate interest won't work either, and that leaves us with consent under Article 6.1a, so more or less the starting point of this whole endeavor. And yeah, theoretically, online behavioral advertisement can be based on consent. Emphasis on theoretically, because in reality it's just too complex. The sheer complexity of it would lead to the situation that the requirements of valid consent could not be met. With data from innumerable sources collected, merged, profiled and shared with who knows who, with innumerable recipients, the requirements of specific and informed consent are almost impossible to meet. To give you a practical example of another case of NOYB's complaints, we looked into the ad network of an online dating platform, and in the first layer of partners, so those companies that the app directly shared personal data with, there were 100 companies. In the second layer, it was already 4,000, and it goes on and on and on. And yeah, can you really consent to such an ungraspable and almost explosive dissemination of your personal data? I don't think you can. And I think that Meta knows this very well, which is why they had this switch to contract in the first place back in 2018, after getting the DPC's blessing to do so. So today, 5 years later, the situation is even less in favor of players like Meta, because new legislations put these business models under further scrutiny. DMA, DSA, we will hear more on that, I suppose, from the other speakers. So it's not gonna work. And one last remark maybe, if it will again take years and years of procedures for the European data protection authorities to put an end to this kind of practice and to now assess the use of legitimate interest or also the use of consent for this online behavioral advertisement, it might well be that the European agency, data protection agencies finally lose consent on data protection matters to a certain extent, because with the new collective redress directive and their national implementations, civil litigation might just prove to be the sharper sword. Think about the numbers we're talking here. So we have hundreds of millions of European users who might be entitled to damages, who might be entitled to claims of unjust enrichment for the unlawful processing of their personal data, of the processing of the personal data without a legal basis and in bad faith for at least 5 years now. So even without the data protection authorities putting a stop to this, to online behavioral advertisement as it's happening right now, it might well be that big tech will have to pick up the bill anyhow in the end, and just be ordered to do so by the courts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco, for articulating your view on the status quo so well, and also pointing out where you see the problems. You talked about largely the GDPR enforcement, but you also highlighted the other legislations that are coming out, Artificial Intelligence Act, DSA, and etc. And I want to direct this question to Sandra. Sandra, you have written previously about how DSA is going to interact with UCPD and how the GDPR and the other legislations that are coming out in the EU are going to create the boundaries for the online behavioral advertising. So my question to you would be, do you see that such legislation, such framework actually makes sure that the OBA is regulated in a way that the harms are safeguarded against? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's a really important question. I'm trying to keep it short to answer this. So yeah, I have written a lot on this topic in the last couple of years, and I just want to highlight two of my main concerns that I had, and then just talk a little bit about how I think that the DSA and the AI Act will address that. And so in 2019, I wrote a paper that was called Affinity Profiling and Discrimination by Association. And so this was around online behavioral advertisement and how it impacts data protection and non-discrimination. And so the first major point that I made in this paper is to say that I don't think actually that we are fully aware of how much information we're giving away when we're sharing data with others. And I think nobody's really aware of that. We think of data as something that has maybe not necessarily the value that it has. So a couple of examples, the way how you move your mouse is enough indication on whether you have Alzheimer's disease, the speech patterns, how you interact with an online assistant, give an indication of whether you're sick or not. So Amazon is using that, for example. They can infer whether you're sick and then offer you products based on that inference. Facebook, we already talked about this, has the ability to infer, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, political leanings, and then uses that information to target you, right? Facebook has used information about sexual orientation to target people with gay cure advertisements. They have also inferred ethnicity about people and excluded them, or allowed advertisers to exclude them from seeing ads about housing, financial services, or jobs. So that is happening, which then led me to the second point in the paper, which is to say that I think the law is not well equipped for that, right? Again, discrimination and unlawful action is not something new. And you could say we have regulation around that. And we do. We have non-discrimination law, for example, but non-discrimination law was written by humans for humans, in the sense that we thought of a perpetrator that is a human, and therefore we created a complaint-based system. And a complaint-based system means that I know that somebody is doing something against me. Somebody is harassing me, somebody is manipulating me, somebody is treating me unfairly. I have a comparative element there. I know that I'm missing out on something, and therefore I have a complaint-based system. So with all those targeting techniques in the online space, that discrimination is happening behind our backs. So I'm actually not aware of it. The Facebook users didn't know that they've been profiled based on sexual orientation. They didn't know that they missed out on job opportunities. And just compare this to the offline space. If I'm going to a supermarket, and there's a bouncer and that person doesn't let me in anymore, I know something's wrong. If I go into the supermarket and I have to pay higher prices than other people, I know something is wrong. I can compare that. In the online world, that's no longer true. And if I don't know that I have been discriminated against or targeted, I cannot use a complaint-based system. It's useless in that environment. And again, that's not a failing of the law. It has just been written with a different perpetrator in mind, with a human in mind, not an algorithm. So those were two of the main things that I have criticized in the past. And so the question now is, has the law now addressed that in a way? And so I just want to quickly talk about the DSA and the AI Act there. And again, it's really hard to make any prognoses yet, because DSA, we don't know. This will take some time. AI Act, that's still in draft form. So there is really just, hypothesis at this point. A couple of things in the DSA that I think are really good, and I've called for it in the past, is that, there's transparency around the fact that you are being targeted. So you know that now. You are also aware now who is the one that is paying for the ad. I think it's really good that it's also moving in a direction where you get information about, why am I seeing this ad? I think there could be some improvement there, because usually the information is not particularly insightful. When I ask, why am I seeing this ad? I get information like, because I'm a woman over 18 and I live in the UK. Both of that is true, but I also know there's more going on behind that. We're going to have the repository for the very large online platforms where they have to put their ads in. I'm really, really happy about the fact that profiling based on sensitive attributes is being banned, which is a really, really, really big step forward. The only thing that I worry about is a little bit of the information overload, and I'm not sure if everyday people who are not in the space of privacy advocacy would want to have all that information overload. The second thing on the DSA that I'm excited about and not quite sure how we pan out is like the internal risk assessment, the Article 33 risk assessment, where the big platforms now have to do internal audits to make sure that how it has an impact on illegal content and gender-based violence, misinformation, that type of stuff. And again, when it comes to internal audits, it's always hard to say how this will pan out. Can we trust those who are making those internal risk assessments? To counterweigh that, there are also external audits that have to be done for the very large platforms and search engines. I've written about this in the past as well, that I think there is a potential risk for political capture because there's only a set amount of players in the market. The cottage industry will be flourishing, and to make sure that they are not being captured by the big platforms is, I think, going to be a challenge going forward. We have seen this during the financial crisis where exactly that thing has happened. So this is the idea about the DSA. AI Act, I'm also really excited about that. Of course, that's not directly on online behavioral advertisement. What's really, really exciting to see, in my opinion, is the current European Parliament draft that just came out 2 weeks ago or a week ago, the high-risk categories, the 8th high-risk category that is about administration and justice and democratic processes has now been amended in a way that could also capture AI that is intended to impact political processes, for example. So if that actually goes through, that could be really, really exciting. Another amendment is that AI systems that are being used by very large platforms that are used for recommender systems, that is a new high-risk category. Again, draft form, we will see if it will hold up in trialogue, but it's super exciting to see that the Parliament is putting that forward. One of the main criticisms that I always had with the AI Act that is very much, product safety, and again, a lot of like internal conformity assessments and documentations, and can we trust those who should follow the rules to, not only write the rules because those are the ones that write the codes of conduct, but can we also trust them to actually make accurate assessments? And so that's still my major criticism here, because most of it is product safety and it is about self-certification, which I have a problem with. But the European Parliament has introduced something that I'm really, really happy with, which is an actual complaint-based system for individuals to complain, because again, it was mainly product system based, and now there might actually be a door for individuals to complain if they think something is unlawful. But again, EP draft, we don't know. Yeah, to sum this up, I think it's really good that we're going in that direction. It's really good to see that Europe is leading the way. I think my main worry is that very often, rather than just banning something or saying that it's not acceptable, we just put more admin burden on those who are in that space. So we don't actually prevent the bad thing from happening. We just make it more burdensome to do so, or more transparent to do so. And I think that again puts an undue burden on citizens who have to constantly worry about their rights. And again, I think ex post transparency is really not the same as ex ante justification. And that's argued many, many times that that's actually where we need to target this, because again, very often I might not know that I've been targeted. I might not know that I had to pay higher prices, or that I have been excluded from seeing certain advertisements. And even if I find out, then it has already happened, right? It's too late at that point. And so you actually need to have a more ex ante approach for that. The last thing I mentioned has to do with the profiling on sensitive attributes, which I'm super happy about that's now banned. In a new paper that I just published, I talk about how algorithms are grouping us in different ways that doesn't correspond with Article 9 GDPR, and it doesn't correspond with the protected groups and the non-discrimination law. Yet those groups deserve protection because they're being used to make negative decisions about people. So we know, for example, that Apple users pay more than PC users. We know that people who use Internet Explorer and I'm more likely to get rejected from jobs rather than people who use Chrome, for example. People who are fast scrollers are more likely to get worse conditions for insurance. So all those groups, right, are not protected currently, but yet they form the basis for targeting and for advertisement. And so I think the law just needs to grapple with the fact that algorithms yet again have behaved in a way that the law couldn't really anticipate. But that's just how the cookie crumbles. I think it will just be very important to keep that in mind and then make adjustments and going forward. But in overall, I'm very happy where we're going, and I think I'm here on the right track. Thank you.
Oh, all right, Sandra. Thank you very much for your evaluation of the state of the art in the boundaries of the online behavioral advertising. I think there is a lot in terms of the how DSA and the AI are going to change the ecosystem. Wojciech, we talked about this before, that your concerns, or we have been talking about the online behavioral advertising in the commercial context, but you have over and over raised also concerns about the online behavioral advertising in political context. So can you please tell us a bit about that, and what is your take on the harms that it might cause, and to what extent it's limited today?
Yes, these topics are definitely connected, and expansion towards the political advertisement was, let's say, natural way of the development. First of all, I have a problem with saying what is the status quo, because you asked before in the general question, what is this, our stand on the status quo, but we know that all the players here try to show that there are the changes, that we have the permanent process of change of view on the behavioral advertisement. I heard that there was a discussion about that during one of the panels before as well, where the representatives of the big companies, especially Meta, were informing that they are actually not collecting the part of the information that we are aware of. So the changes are going on, and we try to also prepare for the changes which are going on with the enforcement of the DMA and the new acts that are going into force. With the political advertisement and I have the general problem, which is that we are operating in completely different environment in the digital world than in the classical political advertisement. The granulation of the message which is sent to the voter was actually understood to be a very good result of the work of the political parties in the past. The natural hero of the party was a person who could translate the program of the party into the message which is sent to the individual person. This individual politician going from doors to doors and being able to explain the program of the political program to the average citizen was actually the kind of template for the political activist. But to do that, that was also important to recognize the behavior of the person that you are talking with. But that was the world that cannot be compared with the digital one, because the assessment of the behavior is not done on the data, on the information, which goes directly from the region, from the constituency where the decisions are done, but is combining the behavior of the person and behavior of the voters from all over the places where the company is doing so. This is not done anymore by the parties, by the politicians themselves, but is done by the outsourcers. And here we have the typical privatization of the public activity. So using the same measures, the same tools, the same techniques that you use in the commercial world for the political, for the assessment of the behavior, for the political means, is actually additional problem for the online advertisements. So we try to add, as the European Data Protection Supervisor, this point of view to the assessments that were done by the European Data Protection Board. But I would like, as the member of the European Data Protection Board, especially drive your attention to quite unquestioned line by the data protection authorities on how the behavioral advertisement has to be understood.
Thank you very much for your answer. I will move to Paul. Paul, you have led the reform of the data protection rules before. And I remember in 2019, it was one of the closing sessions that you were calling for academia using the rules that are already there and interpreting in the spirit of the European values and try the enforcers to take action. It's been 5 years, and I'm very curious to hear your evaluation of the process. Like, how do you think that has taken shape since the entry into force of the GDPR?
I would say that in terms of implementation and enforcement, we have seen progress over these years. I think it is legitimate that some people are not happy with this progress and say it's not sufficient progress. But, with, on the one hand, a legal instrument which by its very nature is a subject of a political compromise, there is no perfect law. So, on some aspects, it's difficult to enforce. And also, on the other hand, data protection authorities who are, of course, legally, formally independent, but and they should be acting as protectors of Europeans all over Europe. But their reality is, of course, they are resourced from national parliaments, and they some of them at least see themselves still as maybe a little bit more. A duty to like a national chamber of commerce rather than a data protection authority. I think we have to live with this. To some extent, because as we see, I would say the activities before the court's rulings, also the activities of the European Data Protection Board bring the system into balance. There is a kinetics inside the GDPR, which I think favors this. I would say both individual data protection authorities and the European Data Protection Board can still do more using those kinetics, providing incentives to those authorities which drag their feet. But I would say the ship is moving in the right direction. And I am also very happy to see that this process is driven to a large extent by, on the one hand, civil society, but on the other hand, also by an opening up of the liability route. I hear about cases on liability, which are, let's say, also developed by innovative law firms. And I think that is really the lesson from GDPR, that it is good to accumulate ways of making the law work. This is a classic theme in American political compromise. The first line of defense, if business cannot avoid the law and the substantive obligation is, they say, well, let's have the law, fine, but let's exclude private enforcement. That's a very American technique to be able to say, you know, Congress has acted, we have a new law, this is good, but the effectiveness of enforcement is severely reduced by excluding private enforcement. So these are false compromises, and we have not made this compromise in GDPR. In GDPR, we have accumulation of ways to make it work. And so I'm quite optimistic that this accumulation of ways of making things work will still play out more in the future. And I give you a few play out more positively. And I give you a few examples. For example, when it comes to the financing of data protection authorities. Well, in the moment, a data protection authority can show that it brings in fines which are substantial, which are much more than the data protection authority costs. The whole argument and discussion about the funding for the authority gets a new dynamic. I would also say that in terms of being able to show the right things, you know, in the end, the authorities which are all called upon to implement the same piece of law have a certain incentive to show that they are, you know, they are standing at least in the middle of European performance and maybe even better. So there is an upward competition in doing the right thing. And we have to look very closely what the determinants for this are. I was, for example, very impressed by the decision of the Italian Data Protection Authority on ChatGPT. It shows that, you know, there are some authorities who have more courage than others, and what could be a determinant, and I'm not saying it's the only one, is the very simple fact that the Italian authority has a college of 4 which decide. It doesn't have one person at the top, but 4 who discuss, who deliberate, and who support each other. 2 of them constitutional law professors, 1 an advocate coming from private practice. It's just a very good composition. And actually, after the ChatGPT, I got back a little bit into the case history of the Italian authority. And I have to say, they have a very good case history already in sensitive sectors, for example, in health. And, you know, one wonders why one country has such a case history and another country doesn't. And I think this type of closer linking of the decisional practice of DPAs to the question, what are the determinants for this? And to a deeper look into the organizational model, the political relations, the funding, and so on, I think it will help the system to be more performant. For online behavioral advertisement, I think the future now is precarious. And I have said that before. The future is open. We have people who would like to dismantle GDPR, you know, open it up, lower the level of protection. But we also have in the European Parliament a growing constituency for the simple interdiction of online behavioral advertising based on profiling of people. I would say, you know, the panel title is actually a little bit under dramatic. We have to be very clear. The issue here is the profiling of people, which is in a democracy, in a free country, whether it's America or Europe, the profiling by the state or by big corporate is a huge impediment of freedom, and it has a chilling effect. And so, you know, let's not be shy. Former American Vice President Al Gore called this the stalker economy model. You know, let's use the appropriate words, and let's also look at the reality of development of alternative business models. I see a scrambling of those companies which depend in their revenues on online behavioral advertisement and thus profiling of people for new sources of revenue, which don't make them any more dependent on this dirty business. And I think that's a good thing, you know. So we should not be shy about saying this business model should not have a future. Of course, when we start going for this directly, we are up against, in the case of Facebook, the 9th biggest capitalized companies in the world. But at the same time, it's a company which has lost 50% of its stock market value in the last year, which shows us that these markets are extremely dynamic. So to conclude, I think there is one avenue which is the enforcement through DPAs. There's another avenue which is the liability road. But then there's also the political avenue. And where the political avenue goes after the next European elections is open. But I would say it is not completely excluded that there is a political alliance which at a certain point in time in the next mandate says, we've had it, this has to end, and there will be a straightforward interdiction. And why do I think this is not completely ruled out? Because also on the right of the political spectrum, there are people who don't want to be snooped on by big state and who don't want to be snooped on by big corporate. And one even sees it in America in the Republican Party. This is not only about the accusation that Silicon Valley is helping the Democrats. It is a basic impetus for individual freedom. And so I am actually convinced already today the stock market value of Facebook reflects this precarity, and the economic pressure to go another way will increase, and that is good. And in parallel to that, I think the political willingness to do straightforward what Sandra's asking, namely not just make it more transparent and make it more burdensome, but straightforwardly to say, no, we don't want this, because we have a very basic principle that in a free society, the means of communication must be free from surveillance. Also, our public sphere must be free from profiling, because this is in the end about the functioning of democracy. I think it is actually possible to construct a political alliance around this if there is the willingness of politics to go in this direction.
Although I try to maintain at least a facade of neutrality about my own opinions, I couldn't agree more for your entire speech. You did mention several things: profiling, ChatGPT, and I'm looking at Mireille, who has written a lot about profiling, but also who has some thoughts about what's next. So I'm very curious to hear, what do you think in terms of, first, online behavioral advertising, where are we now, but also what's coming next, and maybe some of the harms or dangers that we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to follow Paul's advice. I always do that. And not be shy. And I think I have not been shy about the processing of behavioral data. So maybe I take a step back and say that behavioral data and the processing of behavioral data should be seen as infrastructure at this moment. It's going to determine the Internet of Things. It is determining our online environment. So here we have behavioral data as infrastructure. Now, I've been arguing already for quite some time for a complete prohibition on the processing of behavioral data. And I did that 5 years ago, and people laughed in my face, of course. So let me explain why I think that is important. A prohibition of the processing of behavioral data with dedicated exceptions, yes, of course. And we have to think about those exceptions. But let's first talk about the prohibition. So when we're talking about behavioral online advertising, we're talking about two different things. Collection, I would even say construction of behavioral data, one. And then the targeting with the inferences from that data, possibly of other people. Now, where does the business model sit? People think that the money sits in advertising, selling something to these people. I don't think so. The money sits in the intermediaries having this wonderful story that consumers are going to buy things if you behaviorally profile them. So the business model is between the intermediaries and the advertisers, the people that want to sell you toothpaste or any other service. That's one. The other one is the publishers. So the websites that sell advertising space. So that's where the business model sits. And that's where the marketing of these companies' platforms works very well. But the idea that consumers can actually be manipulated into buying things this way is wrong. So there are two things here. And I'm going to explain that also. I don't think behavioral targeting works, not as claimed. I do think, excuse my French, that it screws up our info sphere, our ecosystem. And that's the only thing we have in a democracy to make up our minds about things. So why am I saying that behavioral advertising doesn't work? When I said this to people, they came to me afterwards and they said, Mireille, have you gone wacko? We can see it works because people buy these ads, but that's not proof. And I'm telling them, why should I prove that something doesn't work? Can you prove that this works? And then the question is, who has the data to prove that? And are they ever going to share that with us? No, they aren't. There is now umpteen evidence that publishers, so websites, are not really making much money on selling ads, and that advertisers, when they shift to contextual advertising, sometimes get better reach. Now, the simple explanation for that, and of course we don't have time to go into that deeply, is what is called by an econometrics professor, Goodhart, the Goodhart effect. And the Goodhart effect was summarized in the following statement. If you use a measure, behavioral data is all about measuring your preferences, to put it short. If you use a measure as a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And that is both because for instance, the advertisers are changing their behavior, the policymakers are changing their behavior, but also because the people that are targeted are changing their behavior. And there's long-standing research into this. So now, taking a step back, if behavioral profiling in general, I'm not just talking about advertising, but also talking about behavioral voting targeting, if it doesn't work, but it is very bad for our information ecosystem, then why are we doing this? Okay, that's my position, and it's been my position for a very long time. And I think the GDPR offers many articles, and they've all been expounded here already for a long time, to say that if something is not effective, it cannot be necessary. Even if you work with consent, the processing of that data must be necessary for the purpose. So behavioral targeting and processing is not a good idea under the GDPR. Now, what's the next? Well, the next is, is another form of human behavior that has been transformed into data, and that is going to be the next destruction of our information ecosystem, and that's our language behavior. Large language models, ChatGPT 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, consists The training data consists of behavioral data. It should not surprise us that, that these models come out with something that is extremely fluent, but not necessarily correct. So the same thing is in operation here. If you try to use behavioral data in a metrical fashion, it's not going to work in the end. And my concern is if the output of LLMs, which are trained on behavioral data, on our language behavior, they're parasiting on our language behavior. If that comes out into the public sphere, which is of course already happening, then those systems in the next big training round are going to train on their own output. This is not good news. And anybody who thinks it is, I don't know. So my next concern now is large language models. Am I saying we should stop them? No, but I think, am I saying in favor of a moratorium? No. But I really think we have to proactively consider them for what they are. They are trained on our behavioral data, and it is a miracle to me how the Italian DPA can now say that because there is some transparency, it is okay. I don't see a valid legal ground here. Does it mean that we should never move into that? No, I'm not saying that, but we have to be very careful and we have to foresee the consequences and sit down and think very carefully how this is done. This is not just obviously about the training data, but anybody like me who buys a subscription for GPT-4, you can see the business model coming up, is engaging in what is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. That's the newest gadgets in machine learning. So they have done, let's say in this case OpenAI, have done the reinforcement learning. On top of that, they have laid a layer of human feedback, that's their own human feedback to contain the output. And now we're doing hard work of providing the human feedback. Again, am I saying that I'm against that? That's not an interesting question. We have to think about what's happening here and consider to what extent this is acceptable. And I don't have the answer yet, but I think things are clearly going too fast. And for instance, the idea that a company that has a special department in responsible AI, and that is known for being the nice kid amongst big tech, putting this into their search engine, that is so blatantly irresponsible, I have no words for it.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask panelists if they have responses to each other's or comments. Otherwise, I will. As I mentioned this before, like we obviously talk about what is the problem, and it's important to highlight it and to resolve it. But I'm very curious to also hear if you can. What would be the vision? How would you see the online environment of the future? What would be the aspirational online environment without online behavioral advertising? I don't know if any of you would like to address that, Paul, please.
Yes. So I think there are enough ways to make money and to finance the services which are of interest to people and of public interest without behavioral advertisement. And I think we have to together steer this environment in this direction, because I would agree with Mireille, the biggest danger we are facing is a democracy crisis, which has to do with the destruction of the public space as Habermas described it, the space in which we build our political opinion for a vibrant democracy. This is being destroyed by behavioral advertisement, because it breeds, as an early investor in Facebook said, I forgot his name, but very famous, the most antisocial behaviors. And I think we should not be impressed by the fact that, this is huge money behind it and they are very influential right now and so on. One sees in the opinion polls also in the United States that increasingly people are fed up with this, and I would say that maybe the one or other large incident or accident will drive politics to be a little bit more speedy on this. We are facing here a phenomenon which is the phenomenon of the invisible risk. Most people still, they don't understand what is being done to them, like they didn't understand it with smoking or like they didn't understand it with atomic power. So we have precedents here I have been sitting here before, I think with Julie Brill of Microsoft, who concurred on this. The phenomenon of invisible risk in politics is always a pattern of too late or very late intervention, although the experts already knew things 10 years before. It's the anti-smoking legislation, it came 10 or 20 years after we knew for sure smoking kills. And on atomic power, it's the same. And another good example is the regulation of high seas shipping. You don't see what oil is being left into the ocean. It's far away, it's on the high seas. It's always the same pattern. And so I would say, the reality and the understanding of the populace and also the parliamentarians of all the dirty things happening in the, in big corporate digital, it catches up. It catches up, and it will more likely than not also lead in some countries to pretty draconian measures. If you look at the anti-smoking activities in the United States, if you look at the regulation of sea shipping in the United States, after Exxon Valdez and so on, it has been extremely radical. So often American politics reacts to the catastrophe, to the incident. In Europe, there are similar patterns, maybe a little bit more foresight, maybe a little bit more precautionary principle, therefore, not only driven by incidents, but also driven by incidents. And so I would say the duty of the day is to maintain the primacy of democracy over technology and business interests, and to shape positively the digital environment through the most noble expression of democracy, which is the law. I think we have to rehabilitate the language before the code, and we have to rehabilitate the law before all these dirty attacks which down-talk this act of speaking of democracy to an innovation impediment and a cost factor. That is, in times where we all agree that we have a crisis of democracy, I think this way of talking is part of the crisis and part of the cause of the crisis of democracy. And it has led to a situation in America where basically no good laws are not made anymore which protect people. So I'm starting to get worried about the leadership of America and democracy when I see the impossibility to get anything to through Congress, and at the same time, because of the communication environment which behavioral advertisement has created, a polarization in American society which is explosive. And so I think all this must sharpen our resolve to act through the instruments of democracy in order to maintain the good functioning and primacy of democracy.
Thank you, Paul. Before I move on to Wojciech and then Sandra, just a reminder, I really want audience to be able to ask questions. So we maybe for these responses, we take maximum 4 or 5 minutes in total, and then we move on to the audience. Audience, please come forward to the microphones. Whoever wants to ask a question, we'll collect a couple, and then please, Wojciech.
Just one question and one comment. I will start from the comment about this political decisions that are done and the political answer to the problem of to the problems in the United States and in Europe. I think it would be bad if we try to associate privacy problems with left-wing or right-wing parties. This discussion, which is going on completely different layer. There are bigger differences between the people inside the one party or one fraction than between the fractions themselves. So this is not the problem which is politically colored, but this is the problem which for politics means quite a lot. And if so, if really the problem is the democracy and the danger that is given to democracy by the infrastructure that Mireille was talking about, then we have to look how the behavioral data are processed in the places where democracy is less important. And we have quite a long history of collection of this data, not only by Chinese forces about Uyghurs, but also about the things which happened in Hong Kong some years ago. So why don't we study that? Why don't we study the real effect of the behavioral data contained in the infrastructure in these places? And the second thing, the question, I fully agree that the private enforcement plays an enormous role in the GDPR. But I always ask myself, am I really sure what will be the answer of the courts for the questions that are given in the distributed cases around Europe about behavioral advertisement? Aren't we afraid of the answers given in the on the judicial level to the questions that we put? What if the case law, which is established in different countries of the EU, starts to go to the to allowing the online advertisement, behavioral advertisement?
I see that Sandra has wants to respond, please.
Yeah, just quickly, just one thought about what I wish for the future, because I think that was kind of like the question, like where do I see ourselves going? And so I think there are two things where I would love us to see to put more effort to it on it. And so one has to do when new regulation comes into force or is being drafted, that we really stand up to pressure and lobbying in a way. If you look how GDPR ended up being, and we're now criticizing it, if you compare it to the first drafts of the AI Act, I think GDPR was a masterpiece in comparison to that. You can just see how the strong lobby has created a framework that is basically written by them. And again, we're still a long way, and the European Parliament is doing a lot of great stuff there. But we will see that it took such a long time to get to something that is getting there, and months and years have been wasted on allowing the lobbying to water regulation down and basically make it a very burdensome documentation, self-certification effort, which doesn't actually address all the issues that we see with AI. And I'm bringing this up just to pick up on what was in the news just a couple of days ago, where Sam Altman said, well, if you start to regulate us, we're gonna leave. And it made me so angry. Just imagine I would say that. Just imagine I would go to, I live in the UK, to the UK government and say, I don't want to adhere to those rules anymore. If you force me to comply with the law, I'm going to leave. You know what they would say? Bye. Cheers, goodbye. And rightly so. So the idea of like this exceptionalism that like I don't need to adhere to any rules, like the hubris of this makes me really angry. And so I think going forward for the drafts that are currently developed and in the future, we just really need to push back against this lobbying, because nobody's above the law. And that leads me to the second point, which has to do with, private enforcement. Like, chapeau to Marco and NOYB and the amazing stuff that they're doing. They're like the angels that drive this forward, and many other NGOs, right? But like, oh my God, the stamina that those guys must have. Like 5 years litigation and still not done for a framework that came into force in 2018. And the issue is, within those 5 years, that's half a decade, they made money. They just made money. It's just worth it. And who knows how long the process will take. So again, that means there are other measures that you could do. If you think about what happened in Italy, just telling them to not do any processing anymore, that was much quicker than like years of litigation. I'm not saying that the decision is perfect, but GDPR offers the abilities to have injunctions so you cannot process data anymore. Why not use that? Hit them where it really hurts. So going forward, I think standing up against bullying, a pretty form of lobbying, if you will, and really thinking about the other methods that regulators can use so we don't always have to rely on civil society to do our bidding. I think if we can get that right, I think we're moving somewhere.
Thank you very much, Sandra. He did tweet yesterday that he's staying in the EU, so thank you, Sam. But so I will pick up two questions, one from there and then here. Sorry, Guy, come back. So I'll pick up three questions, and then we try to answer whoever is. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much. I'm Maria Magierska from European University Institute. Thanks so much. It was a very great panel and amazing summary for the conference. And so when I was listening to you, and even during this conference, I heard a lot so many times. So GDPR is great, but it has some flaws. And Brussels effect is so exceptional, but enforcement needs some improvement, and so on and so on. We have this discussion going on. And actually, when I was listening to your panel specifically today, I started to think, is there any actual change that the GDPR has brought to the business model of big tech companies, or in general the nature of informational capitalism, in your view? Because as the way I look at it, I don't see actual change that has happened. But I was wondering, what are your views on this, and if you could give any actual substantive examples. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's pick up the questions, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anna Mazgal from Wikimedia Europe. I would like to follow up on the problem of the destruction of the public sphere. And I think that one of the factors why this business model is so pervasive and has such a detrimental effect is that there is no possibility for a consumer ban. People have nowhere to live, nowhere to go. So we can go from one privatized public sphere environment to the other one, and that's it. And I was wondering what the panelists think about a concept of creating of a proper European digital public sphere, and which would actually enable people to make more choices and be in this environment that is more close to a public square than to a private mall with lots of shops, because this is how it feels right now online. And if that idea gets traction with you, what do you think could be the role of the structures such as European Union in making this environment possible?
Thank you. Guy?
Well, I'm Guilherme Migliora from Leiden University, and this question was provoked by what Paul said, that in Europe it might be imminent that the business model might have to change because the problems we're facing are too big, and I think I agree that the problems are too big, but I particularly don't see that change so imminent, because I mean I've talked with Lex recently about like the problems that we had with Google and Telegram in Brazil regarding a democratic process, and then we have like several other cases throughout the world, and so if this is something that is happening only maybe in Europe, then how do we tackle this to avoid in the end to again export to the fringes of the world all those malices that you've been discussing here? Thank you.
To repeat the questions, just the first one I think was no necessary. We got it. Okay, please. I think Marco wanted to.
Yeah, maybe just on the first question, if there's any actual change in capitalistic models. I do hope so. I do hope it's coming now, because I think nobody was really surprised by the EDPB and then the DPC decision, which was like where the EDPB imposed its will on the DPC, that it doesn't work. That Meta's model on providing inter-allier online advertisement, online behavioral advertisement based on contract didn't work. Big surprise. So this was just, as I said initially, it was just buying time, and it's the same with legitimate interest now. It's not going to work either, and it's not going to be to no one's surprise that it's not going to work. So, but that's the end of the line. There is no other legal basis, and then maybe they can try consent, and that's not going to work either. So, at some point, it's just an enforcement problem. We have it had similarly with the Schrems decisions. No surprise on Schrems 2, I think, and still it took the DPC then afterwards 3 years to finally close their case and do something about it. And that's the bigger problem here. It's not that there is so much legal uncertainty, I think, or that it's so much unclear legal situation as it's often framed by big tech. They always say like, yeah, it's new, it needs to be established what works and what's not. I think very often there's, at least in academia, there's large consensus what works and not, and still it's done by big tech. And then, but at some point there's going to be the end of the line, and the end of the line needs to be enforcement, and either by the DPAs or in a collective redress manner.
Thank you. Paul? Yes, I think, this is a big fight. It's like, how long did we take to have a 40 hours working week? I think, we just need to stay on line and not have any illusion about the realities of capitalism. So I see changes. I see a greater differentiation. Some of the big tech companies try to present themselves as the good guys. They try to change the mechanisms which previously allowed profiling to some extent. So that's for me one example of how there are impacts. And I would say on the question of the public infrastructure, yes, the European Parliament has just finished, for example, a feasibility study on a European platform for TV news content, which brings together all the public TV news and political programs, or it's only for those, from all member states, and automatically translates them and makes them visible in all languages to all people in Europe. We have an incredible rich environment of reliable content produced according to journalistical standards, but we cannot see them because they're all in different languages and distributed in all these mediatheks. So yes, there are people who say we need a public service Facebook or public service social network. I have co-chaired myself with Diane Coyle, the deputy chair of the board of the BBC, a working group, and she is very vocal on these things. And it is important to maintain these ideas and nurture them further, because we have a great tradition, in contrast to America, of public service investment, big money into the public space. Alone in Germany, 9.3 billion euros are spent every year just on public TV. And I think, so this type of question from the lady from Wikipedia is a legitimate question, and we have to continue thinking about these things and working on these things. But in the end, this depends on political majorities. If you vote in a certain way for the European Parliament and for national parliaments, you will never get it. And there are political forces who are actively pursuing an agenda to destroy public service media in Europe and wherever they can. So let's be clear that this is about sustained, hardcore political engagement. It will not come by just tweeting a few things and participating here and there in a discussion.
Please, last word.
The World Wide Web is a European invention, and because it was not invented in Silicon Valley, there was no patent on it. And everything that is built in Silicon Valley is built on top of that European invention. Just to remind ourselves that, yes, we know how to build public spheres. About the question about change of the changes over the past 5 years brought about by the GDPR. The cynical answer is read Johnny Ryan in The Economist of a couple of days ago. Yeah, the United States. I think the United States is actually overtaking us. If I look at the Federal Trade Commission, what they're actually doing, and this is informed, of course, by consumer law and competition law, the head of the FTC is somebody who has a vision, and some people would call that ideological, but I would call people who advocate trickle-down effects and that sort of things, for which there is no evidence, ideological. So what the FTC, for instance, did was say, if you process unlawfully information, then you don't only destroy all that information, all the data, but also the models you built on that. Who cares about destroying that data? You'll get new data. But if you tell that person all models and all applications that integrate that model, you have to destroy it, well, then you're busy with enforcement. That's not being shy. So in a way, I think on both sides of the ocean, there is a lot of extremely interesting things happening. And I think we very much need both the public regulators for the reasons that you just said. So we should not be dependent on who decides to go to a private law court. On the other hand, I absolutely admire the work of various NGOs, one of which is at the table now, which have achieved incredible things. And maybe the question that we have to think about is, what does it mean that a DPO, for instance, doesn't dare to take certain decisions because it knows that the corporation has very deep pockets and can hire all the big law firms and then sue for I don't know how much money. This is not a proper economic system that is that allows a viable democracy. Dus I'm afraid we have to think about the political economy of this, and if we don't, we're going to be sitting here 5 years from now with the same story.
Thank you very much, all of you. Sandra, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone for attending this panel. And the final remarks for Wojciech, so he will address you.
So, dear colleagues, dear friends, that once more I have the honor of delivering the closing remarks to this year's Computer Privacy and Data Protection Conference. Delivering these remarks last year, I spoke about vulnerability. I spoke about how there is an even greater need to address the vulnerability of individuals who are the victims of global pace of change. Whether the pace in technological, societal, or political life. I shared my thoughts on how vulnerability can be addressed by giving the people the choice and opportunity. Yet the choices that data protection is meant to give to the people are still too often seen as privilege rather than the right. This feeling remains strong for me today. It is reinforced, for instance, with what are we witnessing worldwide when it comes to migration, where the vulnerability of the people is even more harshly exposed. This is the context that frames my closing remarks today. Because while we always say that data protection protects the people and not the data, people still continue to lack a real choice over how their data is used. This narrative continues to emerge from the discussion at this year's conference. In exploring the ideas that drive our digital world, we have touched upon innovations such as ChatGPT, as generative AI. We discussed in depth their benefits and what are the risks to privacy, what the risks can emerge. There have been many big ideas over the last year that have driven technological innovation. Together with these new technologies, there have been new approaches. But we must not forget about the fundamental concepts and the values that underpin our aims to protect the people. And I firmly believe that there is a merit in the foundation of the theoretical and practical approaches to privacy, which we have built together over last years. And it is some of these foundations to our thinking about privacy, which I would like to bring to your attention again. Starting with perhaps one of the most influential scholars on privacy, Alan Westin, whose Privacy and Freedom book was published in 1967, so 4 years before I was born, and it laid the philosophical ground for many current debates on technology and personal freedom. In defining the privacy, Westin presented privacy as the ability of individuals to determine for themselves when, how, and to which extent information about them is communicated. This is, of course, changed over the time, both with the famous German judgment and with all the changes which are dealing with public interest and national security. However, I believe it remains at the core of how we view our right to privacy, and especially in the context of self-determination. Yet today, we sometimes overlook that the societal boundaries of privacy and data protection are continuously shifting and orbiting. What is deemed a respect for privacy in one situation can sometimes be deemed as its utter disrespect in another. And the context matters. The emerging ideas that drive our digital world are continuously changing the context in which we operate. Today, our interactions with privacy are much more multifaceted. From the perspective of formula of humanity, privacy has become much more than merely it means. It is indeed because privacy is not self-sufficient, as Westin acknowledged. And what we must continuously strive to protect, especially given quickly contexts change. We see this dual link emerging where the privacy is a right that is fundamental on one hand, yet subjectively perceived, increasingly contextual on the other hand. And take, for instance, the European Health Data Space Initiative, in which the arguments for differentiating the use of health data for primary purposes from those of the secondary purposes is very interviewed with the context of patient and doctor relationship. Take the political advertising, which we were talking about a while ago. Misuse in handling personal data in political communication context have proven to seriously impact our democracies, resulting in a specific context that justifies special attention from the legislator. And I make this effort to delve into the philosophy of data protection and privacy in order to illustrate that contextual privacy can actually be a slippery slope. Because while it can be both beneficial it can be dangerous too, particularly because the norms can sometimes propagate the societal behaviors in a way that do not have the fundamental rights at their core interest. And this is where I believe that was us, data protection authorities and regulators in particular, have a duty to ensure that the actions we take are driven by our priority to protect the people. If not careful, we can otherwise make individuals even more vulnerable. And as my good friend Chris Cooner puts it in the increasingly formalistic mechanism to which we address the data protection under GDPR, concerns run the risk of reducing the fundamental rights to the series of complex and non-transparent procedures, when in fact this would result in the loss of the essence of this right. In order to protect the essence of the rights to privacy and data protection, we need to ask ourselves whether our current framework is delivering on the original ambitions of what this right means to us from the outset. And if after this assessment we continue to have doubts, then it means that we need a change. And let me be clear, when I speak about the change, I do not think about the legislative overhaul, not at all. Instead, the change can mean the increased open mindedness in the way we set priorities for how we protect individuals. Change can mean the strong leadership and consistent actions. We need to be flexible in our mindsets, not only with the reference to how we view data protection and privacy, but with the reference to how these rights form part of the larger digital ecosystem, probably this space for public discussion. We can say that the CPDP is an important part of this discussion because it serves as an opportunity to discuss the intersection of so many different emerging fields of digital regulation, but also because we have the tradition of meeting here not only the people from the academia, not only the politicians, not only the NGOs, but also the people who create the technical version of this world. To debate together how to best safeguard privacy in a way that embeds it as a cornerstone, crucial to the protecting of our digital future, we have here the best place. So be ready for the digital future. We inevitably need to be ready for change because, as I've said, the boundaries of the privacy and data protection are continuously shifting. They will continue to orbit and to oscillate. And we cannot remain static while we do so. We need to react in one way or another. Well, like it was said in Alice in Wonderland, you have to run very fast to stay in the place where you are. And let me finish with it, and let me thank all the people who make CPDP as a wonderful place as it is. Thank the organizers, thank the participants, and give the floor back to Bianca.
Thank you so much, Wojciech, for your closing remarks. I would like to invite Professor Cooner to the stage to give his part of the closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers for allowing to make some closing remarks. I have to say this is a novelty for me. I've, in my career, had many different talks and different conferences, panels, speeches, moderators, but I've never given the closing remarks to such a significant conference as this. It's quite a burden, but I think it also gives me a lot of freedom so that I can just say some things that I think are important. And that's exactly what I will do. I can tell, I'm very surprised that there are so many people still here. I think all of us then are qualified as being the real data protection freaks. So let's revel in that. I know that this is usually done by Professor de Hurt, who kind of gives an overview of data protection developments over the year. I'm certainly not going to do that. I want to do it a bit differently. And I decided I would just mention 4 points that I find important in the current data protection climate. One relates to a phenomenon in the law. The second is a point concerning data protection scholarship. The third is a significant global problem that we all face, which I think also is relevant to data protection. And the following, I will just give a few quick remarks of advice to young academics working in data protection. So first of all, when I observe the state of the law in data protection, I wouldn't, if you ask me what is your biggest concern, I wouldn't talk about some substantive issue in the law. I would instead look at the phenomenon of fragmentation. And what I mean is that there are all sorts of data-related legislation and regulatory instruments being proposed without, I think, sufficient thought having been given to their interaction. And there's certainly been concern about overlapping legislation in the EU, but I think this is a phenomenon that goes beyond the EU. To be sure, there's nothing wrong with fragmentation in the law per se, as this has always existed and is even a normal feature of the international legal order. However, it can also cause problems if it creates overlaps between different instruments and confusion about which laws apply to which types of data processing. And indeed, I think we're running the risk now of creating a kind of data protection cacophony. So I think this requires careful attention when drafting legislation to ensure the interaction between them is adequately considered. I don't think it's sufficient in this regard to simply say, this legislation shall apply without prejudice to X. We need a little more detail than that. And this also provides a special opportunity for academics, because I think we really need some good quality academic scholarship about interaction of different instruments. There has been some of this, but I think we could use more. So secondly, talking about an issue in data protection scholarship that interests me, I think that we run the risk of focusing too much on the latest phenomena at the expense of how the law has developed over time. That is, we focus too much on where we are going and not where we came from. Data protection has existed since at least the 1970s, so we now have over 60 years experience with it. Examining the development of the law could give important insights that could better help us understand current issues. Other fields of law, and for example, public international law, have experienced a quote, historical turn in recent years, which can be defined as reviewing the history of a legal discipline to examine links between the past and present situation of norms, institutions, and doctrines. Data protection law is marked by a recurrence of intractable questions that continue to plague us and keep arising over the years in different contexts, such as what is personal data, how should a data controller be defined, what is an international data transfer, et cetera, et cetera. I think data protection law could also profit from a historical turn in which we focus not only on the latest developments, but also look back over the last 30, 40, 50 years or more to understand how concepts and rules arose, what their original purpose was, and how they have changed over time. Third, I would like to address a major global challenge, which I think should concern all of us here, namely climate change. I do not think that the data protection world is immune from the responsibility to take climate change into account in our activities. Indeed, the fact that data protection is a fundamental right seems to me to require the data protection world to devote special attention to minimizing our climate footprint. Thus far, I have not seen much attention given to this issue in the data protection world. To get a better sense of this, I conducted a very unscientific study myself of the websites of 12 DPAs worldwide, where I searched to see if they had adopted any policies regarding reducing their climate footprint. I found of these 12, only 4 DPAs that address this on their website, and this includes the Federal Privacy Commissioner of Canada, the CNIL, the EDPS, and the UK Information Commissioner. I commend all of them for doing so. And there may be more, of course, but this was just a very limited informal survey. I also searched the websites of some major annual data protection events and didn't find any of them that mentioned their impact on the climate. So I think it's clear that sooner or later, climate activists are going to start asking questions about why it is necessary to have so many conferences that require so many people to travel all over the world. Thus, I think that at a minimum, every DPA, privacy law event, university, and any other organization involved in data protection should review its carbon footprint, adopt a publicly available policy or declaration explaining how they seek to minimize it, and offer as many events as possible, at least in hybrid format. Finally, let me give a few pieces of advice for young academics working and publishing in data protection law. And I say this also because I know this conference was really originally a conference for young academics. I remember the first CPDP conference, and that was really the focus of it. And I think those of us who have been working in this field for many years have a responsibility to pass on our experience and serve as mentors for young academics. So a few very quick, brief points. My first message to all of you is that you are in the right field. Much law is intensely boring. This field is not boring. It is fast-moving, it is interesting, and it presents great opportunities for motivated young academics. It is important always to read more than you write, and also to read broadly. This means reading not only privacy books or technology law books, but also about other legal topics, and also history, fiction, poetry, and other areas in as many languages as possible. You may have read the latest privacy books, but do you know, for example, what did Dostoevsky say about privacy in From the House of the Dead? If you don't, you should know that. When you do write, you should work with the greatest care and the greatest humility. You should weigh and balance every word you write like a medieval craftsman working on a woodcut or an etching. And remember that in academic writing, less is more. Rigor, precision, and focus beat length and verbosity every time when it comes to quality. Don't let them turn you into a bureaucrat. And I know that's easier said than done. So real scholarship is not defined by metrics and has nothing to do with filling out forms. Perhaps more important, guard your independence and your reputation passionately. Be vigilant for those who want to use you to advance their own interests, whether they are from the private or the public sector. So this brings me to the end of these few comments. I really hope that I've given you some things to think about and to ruminate on during the coming year until the next iteration of this great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kuhne, for those inspiring words, and thank you again to the supervisor and his team for the closing remarks. I just take one more minute before everybody's free to go after these super long and tiring 3.5 days. I just want to extend a really warm thank you on behalf of the whole CPDP team for being here, for everybody's work in making this happen, all of our partners and supporters and collaborators without whom none of this would be possible. And particularly a big thank you to my team at Privacy Salon, to all of the people behind the scenes that make it happen, all the volunteers, our catering, our logistical crew, our technical crew. Really a huge round of applause to everybody. And we invite you to enjoy the final cocktail with us this evening, just behind the stage.